Hello, everybody. This is Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and today I'm talking to Professor Zlatko Hadžidedić, the director of the Center for Nationalism Studies, located in Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Professor Hadžidedić, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me.
Well, thank you very much for saying yes, because you were pointed out as one of the specialists from, Bosnia, to discuss the role of nationalism in the dissolution of Yugoslavia and also in today's politics. And maybe can you start maybe with an overview of the way that you approach the dissolution of Yugoslavia and how you define nationalism and the different nationalisms that you think are crucial to understand the process?
Well, I have my own approach, and I have published it in my book, Nations and Capital, The Missing Link in Global Expansion, published by Routledge in 2022. I truly think, as far as I could observe, that the rise of nationalism coincided with the influx of capitalism in the former Yugoslavia. People say that nationalisms were sleeping, so to speak, and then suddenly woke up. That's the usual narrative. But what I can testify as someone who was living in the former Yugoslavia, nationalisms were totally irrelevant as a narrative. That's something which in a socialist country was totally irrelevant because it was mainly about belonging to the working people and telling people that you belong to the working class or to the Communist Party and things like that. So those were the leading narratives. It was not about nationalism ever that we spoke about. So I have to say that literally with the influx of capitalism back at the end of the 80s, the rise of nationalism took place. And I wrote a book which explains the link between capitalism and nationalism. It's a general theory of nationalism. It's not on the former Yugoslavia. It's not even on Europe. It's just a very, very general theory of nationalism, which says that capitalism needed nationalism in order to survive, that capitalism has a built-in error, which is about creating a gap between the rich and the poor to such an extent that it inevitably creates conditions for rebellious masses to come on stage and eventually change the system. And in order to survive, to actually keep capitalism intact, capitalism needed a kind of social glue that would bridge the gap, at least ostensibly bridge the gap between the rich and the poor. And that was the ideology of nationalism, which preaches that we are all equal, we all have equal rights, we belong to the same nation, we have common interests and so on, regardless of the fact that the top 1 or the top 10, whatever, percent of the population take 90% of income. Nevertheless, we belong to the same nation. Also, nationalism played a very specific geopolitical role in the expansion of the British Empire, which was the leading capitalist power. Practically, Britain was exporting this ideology under the guise of liberalism, and it never had to fight wars with competing empires, such as the Spanish or Portuguese empires, or the Ottoman Empire, Habsburg Empire, the Dutch Empire, and so on. Eventually, they were all defeated through national revolutions, led by the so-called liberals. They never thought about themselves as nationalists. If you take a look at Mazzini, if you take a look at Simon Bolivar, if you take a look at Kemal Pasha Ataturk, they were all self-confessed liberals. They never claimed that they were nationalists. They were preaching liberal ideology against absolutism, for equality and so on. But at the bottom, actually, they were organizing national revolutions, which were introducing the ideology of nationalism, and which eventually turned their own places into nation states. Similar thing happened with the former socialist or communist bloc. All the complex states, including the Soviet Union, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, although Yugoslavia was a socialist country but did not belong to the bloc, they had this complex federative structure, and eventually they all dissolved in a very similar manner with the introduction of capitalism as an economic system into their political space. They dissolved into nation states with the rise of nationalisms in each of the constitutive or constituent republics. So it was a very similar process, and we saw it here. Some people don't remember it. They picked up the narrative about sleeping nationalisms and so on. But I had more theoretical knowledge, so to speak, so as to try to analyze the things from a different perspective. So in my view, that was the primary trigger and the primary reason for the introduction of nationalism as a narrative, as the dominant narrative in all the Yugoslav republics.
And
Unfortunately, Bosnia and Herzegovina, for some people, fortunately, for greater Serbian nationalists or for greater Croatian nationalists, fortunately, for Bosnians, unfortunately, Bosnia was not officially constituted as a nation state. Even in the former socialist Yugoslavia, Bosnia was a different place. It was constituted as a republic consisting of 3 ethnic groups, all of which it would be more accurate to say ethno-religious groups, actually, because in the 19th century, they all turned into ethno-religious from religious. The Orthodox Christians became Serbs, the Catholics, under the influence of Croatian nationalism from Croatia, became Catholics and so on. Eventually, Muslims adopted this name Bosniaks, which actually belongs to all the people who live in Bosnia. It's not specifically reserved for Bosnians. So this kind of religious community turned into ethno-religious communities, but there was something else. I would say a mistake, but some people still don't correct this mistake. They still call them nationalities or nations, which actually gave them the right to claim sovereignty and to try to secede from Bosnia. So Bosnia entered this process of dissolution of Yugoslavia with these 3 groups, 2 of which were claiming secession and claiming to become a part of Greater Serbia or Greater Croatia. One of them was claiming to defend the integral Bosnia, but as a matter of fact, the leadership was also looking at the possibility to create its own private small state, which would belong exclusively to Muslims. And for Bosnia, what was particularly tragic and what was particularly dangerous at the time, and turned out to be tragic actually, was the so-called Lisbon Conference, organized by the then European Community in 1992, prior to the war. So prior to the war, the European Community and the conference was officially presided by the Portuguese diplomat José Coutilheiro, but actually it was effectively led by Lord Carrington, who was also presiding over the conference on the former Yugoslavia. They introduced the idea that these three ethno-religious communities who were living mixed all the time for all these centuries, people were living door to door, without any separate territories. They came up with the idea that these three groups should organize themselves into three separate territories. If you ask me, that was the crucial thing. Some of them adopted it with enthusiasm, some with less enthusiasm, but eventually they all adopted the idea. And if you ask me, that was the trigger for everything that took place in Bosnia, because you cannot create three separate, three isolated territories out of mixed population without a war.
Yeah.
You need a war for that.
Right.
And the war was actually fought along the lines that were pre-negotiated at the Lisbon conference. All the militaries were taking territories which were already given to so-called their ethno-religious groups at the Lisbon conference. So the European community was, to the greatest extent, to blame for everything that happened. Of course, these ideas were coming from the British diplomacy. I should emphasize that. But the European community at the time and to the present moment has never abandoned this very idea that ethnic partition of Bosnia is somehow the best solution. For Bosnians, it was never the best solution. Of course, there were some ethno-nationalist elites who saw their chance in creation of separate territories and taking up resources in these territories and so on. But for the most of the population, that was certainly not the best solution. It was by far the worst solution, which actually pushed people into counting themselves who is dominant in terms of numbers in this part of territory or in that part of territory. And eventually you get tensions, you get three narratives about three separate statelets which need to be created, and eventually you get a war which separates these three groups.
Yeah. And
of course, with a great help from the neighboring Serbia and Croatia and the aggression of their armies in Bosnia.
I mean, what you're explaining here, I think is really, really important to dig deeper on. But you said something 5 minutes ago that intrigued me quite a bit. You said that these nationalities, the way that people conceive themselves as belonging into one or the other box, was not, or I understood you that you said this was not the way that people conceptualized themselves in the 19th century or earlier.
Yes.
And that, because to me it was always clear, Serbs are Orthodox Christians, the Croats are the Catholics, and the Bosniaks are the Muslim population, and that they, in different periods, different people had power over the construct within which they were, because also before Yugoslavia, of course, there was the before the socialist Yugoslavia, there was the Kingdom of Yugoslavia. Before that, it was part of the Habsburg Empire, basically, and changed hands, and the Ottomans were playing a role as well, right? But you're saying that the idea of these three groups itself is a relatively recent phenomenon, as in 150 years max.
Yes, that's true. You can check it if you just take a look at the Greater Serbia program, so-called Načrtanje, by Ilya Garashanin. There he refers to all Bosniaks as Bosniaks of Orthodox faith, of Latin faith, and Mohammedan faith. And he is trying to consider which one would be easier to convert to Serbian nationhood, to Serbian national identity. And he says, well, it won't be difficult with our brethren who are Orthodox Christians. We will simply send priests from Serbia there and so on to tell them that they are Serbs. They will adopt it. And they did it, actually, because Bosnia was under the mandate of the central patriarchy in Constantinople prior to that. But the Serbian Orthodox Church bought the mandate from the Universal Patriarchy in Constantinople precisely after the Načertanije, sometime around 1850s. And they started sending priests from Serbia, and they were preaching this precisely, that they were all Serbs. And for them, Orthodox Christians meant, from then onwards, it became the same thing to say the Serb and Orthodox. And the same thing happened with Catholics, Croatian nationalists who were on the rise in the 19th century already. They did practically the same thing with their priests and so on. So Muslims remained just with their religious name until 1993, when there was a kind of, well, council, to say the least, of the Muslim leaders. So it was not something of a wider significance. It was a half secret meeting, actually, when they decided to change the name from Muslims into Bosniaks. But actually, the name Bosniaks belongs to all, Bosnians. Yeah. It is just an archaism from the 19th century.
It's just also the naming conventions that we're using are sometimes extremely are sometimes extremely confusing, because we use the same things to refer to different concepts, including, of course, the fact that we have a country which we usually call Bosnia, but the entire country is called Bosnia and Herzegovina, and within that you have a Bosnian part and a Herzegovinian part, right? And we have the sometimes Bosniaks referring only to
historically it used to be Bosnia. It was only added at the Berlin Congress in 1878. Herzegovina was added then. I would say under the influence of Serbian nationalists, because their idea was that, the identity of Bosnians had to be split into two, also in order to be easier for conquering in terms of this narrative that was being sent from Serbia.
Right.
So under their influence, the Berlin Congress introduced this Herzegovina, although historically speaking, Herzegovina was only a region of Bosnia, nothing else. Prior to that, it was always considered a region of Bosnia, like Krajina, like Posavina, or whatever.
The other thing that you said that I think is so important is to understand how it happened. Something that a very close Serbian friend from Kosovo of mine pointed out, and you alluded to it as well, is that these different ethnicities, nationalities,
Also,
religions, they lived next to each other, not just in territories, but house next to house, which is why then the war also became so insanely bloody. Because it was not just clearly separatable territories, but they lived house next to house because it used to work until it didn't. And this process from being neighbors that have no problem with each other to being neighbors that pick up like guns in order to fight each other. What to you, like, what is it that led to this also over the years? Like, what blew it up? What blew the social cohesion up?
It's not about social cohesion, I mean, eventually it turned out to be about social cohesion, but it started with the clear military aggression by Serbia. It was the same in Bosnia as in Kosovo. The Yugoslav army turned out to be an instrument of greater Serbian policy. and they were simply trying to expand Greater Serbia by what they were conquering. In Croatia first, then in Bosnia. I mean, they led one fake war in Slovenia. It was not a real war. They were actually withdrawing from Slovenia, but they occupied several parts of Croatia in 1991. And then also they were preparing for the conflict in Bosnia. They were occupying territories and so on. Yugoslavia used to have a system that was similar to American in the military sense. Each republic had its own national guard, so-called. Just like in America, that you have states having their national guards. Each republic had its own so-called territorial defense, precisely in order to resist the aggression, the possible or potential aggression by the Central Army. And what happened in Bosnia is that the Yugoslav army actually took all the weapons from the territorial defense 1 year before the war. So they were disarmed. Those who were supposed to defend Bosnia from the Yugoslav army, they were disarmed, and it was an easy thing for the Yugoslav army to occupy the territories which were given to the Serb entity at the Lisbon Conference.
But why did it come to this in the first place? I mean, or let me ask differently. Why did Yugoslavia under Tito work and then not anymore after, well, 8 years after he died?
I think I have explained that. It worked on a different pattern.
The communist, so the communism was
socialist pattern. Nationalism was not relevant. It was not a way of social promotion. You know, you have to put all these things very pragmatically, so to speak. People classify themselves along the lines of pure interest most of the time. Sometimes there is religion that plays a role, so there is a kind of a bit of irrational behavior in that, but most of the time they classify themselves along the lines of pure interest. If you are being socially promoted by belonging to the Communist Party and claiming brotherhood and unity to be the supreme value, then you are belonging to the Communist Party, and then you are promoting brotherhood and unity, because that's a pattern of social promotion. If you suddenly wake up in a system which says, no, from now onwards, you will have ethno-religious parties as the dominant ones, and the way of social promotion is to belong to these 3 parties, then all of a sudden you have the majority of population classifying themselves along these lines. So there is nothing irrational about that. That is the key how nationalists operate. That is the key how communists operate. Each system does the same thing, establishes a pattern for social promotion. And then those who want social promotion, who want to belong to something, who want to get jobs, who want to be recognized socially, they classify themselves along the lines which are dominant at the moment.
But in both cases, the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia, we have seen how the nationalists kind of came out of the communist structures, right? Boris Yeltsin was a communist project, and also the leader of the Croats. I mean, the leader of the Croats, Tudjman. Tudjman was a communist Yugoslav leader. So how does the change then happen within the society that goes from one system of promotion to the nationalist system of promotion?
Well, it usually happens with what happens from the outside. If you have a strong pressure, as we did in the former Yugoslavia, to introduce capitalism, as they did in the Soviet Union eventually, also to introduce capitalism. You see people turning to the patterns that are being promoted by the capitalist system, and they recognize it. And the first one to recognize these things are those who are closer to the sources of power, the communists. In this case, they were closer to the sources of power, and they were the first ones to recognize the change of the game. And as soon as they realized the change of the game, the change of the pattern, they just turned to the winning one,
Right.
They abandoned the losing one and they turned towards the winning one. The same happened, after the Second World War when communism won. So many people who were not communists, they suddenly turned to be communists because that was the way of social promotion.
So you smell the change, and then you go.
Before the Second World War, there were only 3,000 communists in Yugoslavia. At the end of the process, let's say in the 80s, you had over 1 million of that. You can say, well, it's an influence of pressure, influence of ideology, but no, it was an influence of this pattern of social promotion. If you want to be recognized in a society, if you want to get a job, if you want to get a leading job, if you want to be a politician even, then you become a communist. So many people turned out to be communists just because of that, not because of their deep convictions. The same thing happened with nationalism. With the influx of capitalism, they just turned to nationalism as a way of social promotion. And that was also an easy way for those who were successful in that, those closer to the sources of power, to get a lot of resources into their hands in the process of privatization. It happened in the Soviet Union, it happened in Yugoslavia, in Czechoslovakia, in all the former communist countries. It happened like that. Those who were closest to the sources of power, the communists, they became the leading capitalists, or their sons or relatives, they became the owners of the previously held state-owned, factories and the industry as a whole.
Which then of course creates the oligarchy of the of the very near future.
Yes.
Because money then also buys
from one oligarchy to another.
Yeah.
So you change the narrative with the change of the economic system.
So in your studies of nationalism, especially in the context of Yugoslavia and now the Balkan states, what is your view on is there any moment when nationalism actually has a healthy role to play, so to speak, in a society? Or are these always forces that will naturally lead to militarization and to ostracization and to mass violence?
Well, I would rather put it this way. You have no other option. The capitalist world is the world of nation states. The only way for survival is to be a nation state. Now, you are Swiss, right? Try to imagine Switzerland classified along the lines of Bosnia and Herzegovina, with each group call itself a nation, and claims a right to be a part of Germany, France, or Italy.
Yep. You could do that very easily. Switzerland and Bosnia to me are very similar, very, very similar the way they are made.
Yes, but you call it ethnic, identity.
Yeah.
And you have Swiss national identity.
Yeah.
In our country, in Bosnia, Bosnian national identity is simply forbidden. It's something which cannot get official status.
By who or what kind of forces prevent?
Well, by these forces which are pressing from Serbia and Croatia, who are interested in ceding parts of Bosnia and, one part to Croatia, one part to Serbia. Also, those who want their small Muslim state, they also have this interest. So practically only those who don't see themselves as members of any of these three groups, they would say, we are Bosnians. But even when they say, or I should say I, because I belong to that group, when I say that I'm a Bosnian, I have no official status. I'm not recognized in the constitution. And when there is a census, I can only put myself among others. But it is directed census, which says that you have to be Bosniak or Muslim by nationality or ethnicity. They put it like that, as if it is the same thing. But you have to put it like that. But Bosniak, Serb, Croat, by ethnicity or nationality. So people naturally recognize that that's the way of being, constitutionally recognized.
But this
And if you are something else, if you don't want to belong to these three, then you are not being recognized. Just try to imagine the situation in which the Swiss nation would not be recognized in the constitution.
Why is that for Bosnia? Well, I mean, because like the European
had a lot of
Union
influence
from keeping it together, right? But then you don't create the intellectual narrative underground in order for people to understand themselves as part of the same polity.
Well, so many of intellectuals are trying to create this Bosnian national narrative, but simply politicians are deaf to that. And you have the strong pressure from Serbia and Croatia, and you have a strong pressure from the European Union, and strong pressure from the UK, strong pressure from the US as well, not to introduce such a thing. They obviously want Bosnia to be like this and probably eventually dissolve. The US so far were protecting territorial integrity, unlike the European Union and the UK. They opted for territorial integrity of Bosnia, but the current administration is already spreading rumors that they are ready to reconsider this policy and that they might eventually allow the dissolution of Bosnia and secession of parts to Serbia and Croatia. So it's a very tough situation when you have the neighboring countries, when you have the local communities, the local elites, I would say, the local oligarchies, which find interest in the dissolution of the country, and when you have the global players who also, for some reason, have this option on the table as the only one. So far, they have never reconsidered this policy. They have never tried to consider the option of Bosnian nationhood as such, for Bosnia to be organized just as the rest of the European countries. Each time they claim you are different, you have to remain different, and so on and so on, and we are remaining different, and it leads to further conflicts.
This. So I view this as a very dark poison. This idea of ethnicities that have to be different from each other. On the one hand, I recognize that people define themselves what groups they want to see them or conceive themselves of as part of. On the other hand, we have some of this being also manufactured from the outside, and it leads people then to even be violent in their thoughts. And I visited this very close friend in Herzegovina, a Croat, defining himself as Croat in Herzegovina, and in his neighboring house there was a wedding party, and at the wedding party the people were singing "Death to the Serbs" as one of the wedding songs. And that was deeply shocking to realize that that's what's being sung. What would be your recommendation of how to suck this poison out of a society when these groups are so much already like accustomed to the idea that the other one must be hated?
Well, I would say it is not so difficult, just as it was not so difficult to turn communists into nationalists. You just need a change of narrative. And it needs to be, promoted from the above, from the intellectuals and from the state. And also from the international community, because the international community, whatever that means, I prefer to say the UK, the EU, and the US, because these are three separate entities most of the time. Some say that Russia is also being involved. There are narratives in the West that Russia has prepared all these things and so on, which is ridiculous because Russia is just taking advantage of the situation to promote its own power, which is practically non-existent. They are pretending that they have influence these days. But even during the war, when the Russians were starving under Yeltsin, we had the British propaganda saying, well, we cannot intervene because Russians are supporting the Serbs and we cannot make the Russians angry. And Russians were totally powerless. They couldn't do a thing. And actually, the British were promoting these Serbian aggressions in Croatia, in Bosnia, in Kosovo. They were backing Serbia from the 19th century. It was their pawn on the table from the 19th century in the attempts to undermine the Ottoman Empire. They had two players, mainly Serbia and Greece, which served the purpose of undermining the Ottoman authority in the Balkans. So they were spreading things about Russians, but I would really leave Russians aside, although they are being more and more active, pretending to have some big influence. Of course, they are fishing for, if not for love or something else, but fishing for influence by pretending to have it more than they actually do. That's what they are doing these days, but we should be clear, Russia has no such influence, has never had in the Balkans. This was mainly the place where the UK and France had their own particular influences, mainly through Serbia. So my recommendation to get back to your question would simply be to change the narrative. It is very simple. You see, I will tell you one interesting anecdote. It is a true story. I will not mention the name, but I spoke, let's say, some 15 years, no, it was more than 15 years ago, 17 years ago, with a guy who was the main advisor to the Serbian leader in Bosnia, Dodik, who was his ideologue, who was his Steve Bannon from Trump's first mandate, that kind of a relationship. And he said, when we got introduced, at the time I was advisor to one of the Bosnian ministers at the national level and one of the party leaders as well. So we spoke in that capacity at the time. And he said, well, this can be a normal country in 2 years, but let's try to make a deal. And I believe that it can have a common identity, a Bosnian identity in only 10 years. Because I can pretend to be a Serb as much as I want. But when I go to Serbia, they explain me that I'm Bosnian. So, Serbia is ready to use them as an instrument, but is not so happy to admit them into their
Yeah, but this is
actually control.
this is very important. I mean, people define themselves also negatively. A Colombian friend once asked me, so you speak in Switzerland 3, 4 languages, different religions, social statuses, and so on. What makes you Swiss? And one of my answers to that is the awareness that we are neither the Germans, nor the French, nor the Italians. So we are
Yes.
more than willing to stick it out together and to attribute Swiss to each other, knowing that that actually combines it,
As
right?
simple as that. Yeah.
So,
And we even speak the same language,
which
So
for
only
some reason is
religions-
contested. I mean, even the name of the language is contested.
Of course, everyone is picking it up for himself or herself. That's something which is quite funny.
These days, I just call it cheekily Southern Slavic.
Yeah, I mean, well, Southern Slavic, that implies Slovenians and Macedonians. They do speak different languages. We can understand each other, but those are different languages. But, in Croatia, Serbia, Bosnia, and Montenegro, people all speak the same language. We perfectly understand each other. Differences are like between Swiss German and German German.
Yeah.
Those are the differences.
Or even smaller. May I just ask, like, because if your analysis is that nationalism is an inherent feature of capitalism, and we acknowledge that we live in goddamn capitalist worlds, most parts of the globe, at least in market economies, what would be in your view, or what is needed in order to prevent capitalism from completely blowing up societies into these nationalist parts, like the way that we create laws against monopolies in order to prevent that part of capitalism from then eating up itself.
Yeah, but now that has been actually eliminated, and now we are entering the phase of hyper-capitalism. I'm afraid that the counter process is underway and that we can't do much at this point. People like Donald Trump or Viktor Orban or Erdogan and so on, they are not accidents. It's a part of the general tendency. It's a part of the tendency of hyper-capitalism to introduce something which I labeled not populism as others. I call it authoritarian nationalism, because democratic principles are being eliminated in order to introduce authoritarian principles. That's exactly what is happening in most of the states, not only in Europe or the US, it is happening around the world. And I strongly believe, I'm afraid, that we will have the next 30 years of hyper-capitalism combined with authoritarian nationalism. And we will not be able to do, yes, much stronger nationalism than we used to have. Something like the 30s in Europe. I would not call it fascism, because the then fascism didn't have hyper-capitalism as a reference. This will be something probably much worse, with much less social solidarity than fascism used to have. The priority will be the promotion of the real oligarchs, of the top 1 or the top 0.1, the richest people, and the transformation of the states into private property. I would say that's what is happening these days in the US, precisely, and that's pretty visible, pretty spectacular, the way it's happening.
But so
we have the oligarchs who are becoming the owners of the entire state, and we already have something that most of Americans didn't want to recognize, but now are slowly recognizing. Actually, the judiciary and legislative power have been already eliminated. Now you only have executive power concentrated in few hands, and you don't really have the state as they used to have according to their constitution.
And but under your interpretation of how nationalism works, this would also naturally lead to even more nationalistic fervor. And wouldn't that mean that it then does what Marx predicted? It's the kernel of what is going to blow up the system itself, because what happened to Yugoslavia might happen to other societies in Europe and even North America.
Well, Yugoslavia dissolved as a ideologically communist country. The same happened to the Soviet Union. We don't know yet whether capitalism can dissolve, it can implode, but what follows next is something which has remained unknown. I remind that Karl Polanyi, for example, he predicted that capitalism would eventually destroy itself precisely because of this self-destructive mechanism that it has. I, so to speak, revised his theory, saying that nationalism plays the role to actually, change the entire social hierarchy in a way as to present it as a society of equals, and it stands as a kind of global social glue, not global glue, not yet.
Yeah.
It is something which was characterizing classical capitalism. Now, with a new form of capitalism, call it hyper-capitalism or whatever, we have something which I would rather call authoritarian nationalism. It means more nationalism, and it means that nationalism will still make capitalism survive. I don't think it will be an implosion on the social level because of more nationalism. More nationalism will mean more cohesion within the society, more homogeneity, and so on. Capitalism can only implode due to economic reasons, due to its own bubbles that creates and things like that. That may cause an implosion. But otherwise, this leverage that it uses, authoritarian nationalism, is something that will perfectly preserve capitalism for the next 30 or more years.
That makes me realize that we kind of talk about two phenomena. One is this authoritarian nationalism, which is actually a unifying nationalism of like keeping the system together. The other one is the nationalism that blew up the Yugoslavia and the Soviet Union.
Don't think so. Each of them is keeping some forms of some projected forms together. In Bosnia, it was destructive because it was actually meant to keep Greater Serbia together.
Mm-hmm.
We didn't have Bosnian nationalism at all. I just explained that.
Mm-hmm.
That's why Bosnia dissolves, because of the presence of nationalisms which are supposed to create Greater Serbian and Greater Croatian entities, which were projected in the 19th century already. So nationalism always plays a homogenizing role. It is only that nationalism based on democratic principles is no longer valid for a society which is being exposed to hyper-capitalism, to hyper-exploitation, to hyper-extraction, and so on, and hyper manipulation, if you like, in terms of finance. So for that kind of capitalism, we need authoritarian nationalism, where democratic principles are simply removed.
Yeah. Yeah. And
But nationalism is always there to keep society together while capitalism exploits it, to put it in the simplest terms.
yeah, but there's still something I don't. Why is it that China? Well, no, sorry, China is a bad example because capitalist socialist. But why is it that certain nationalisms keep large groups together, whereas other nationalisms work on balkanizing the larger groups into smaller groups?
Well, it all depends on the narratives which are being adopted. It depends on who is supporting whom on the geopolitical level, who wants smaller states, who wants bigger states, and so on. Eventually, you have the interplay between the great powers most of the time, which are actually pushing minor states to further fragment and things like that, while preserving themselves as bigger and bigger
Entities.
So that's a kind of natural geopolitical logic. If we just put it under this, angle, if we look at it through this lens, that greater power game decides eventually on the geopolitical structure of the world. Unfortunately, it is so. And the minor players are always the losers who are being fragmented.
I believe that's very much correct.
Once upon a time, Iraq was a very powerful country under Saddam. What has remained of it? Several competing nationalisms.
Yeah.
The same thing happened with Syria. The same thing happened with Libya, with Yugoslavia. It's even happening with Bosnia, unfortunately. So it all depends on what kind of geopolitical projections have been made. Some people, let's say London mainly, but also in Washington, they think that Greater Serbia is a better option for their interests, and so is Greater Croatia. Also, Macedonia is in a similar position as Bosnia. They see Bulgaria and Albania as those who should take parts of Macedonia and make it simply disappear. I recently spoke with some Macedonian diplomats about that, and they are totally aware of it. They know that all these problems that Greece is creating about the name and so on, it's only to put them, in some form of waiting for something to happen, but that something is actually the partition along the lines of Slavic and Albanian. Because despite the developed Macedonian nationalism, now a different example, they have a developed Macedonian nationalist narrative. They have a developed nationhood, if you like. But some people in the powerful places, they simply consider them Bulgarians. They don't want to see them as Macedonians. And they think it's better to have Greater Bulgaria and Greater Albania, and that's it. Even this solution with Kosovo is a kind of temporary solution, because the original idea was to have Greater Albania, not to have Kosovo and Albania. So it was probably due to the American dilemmas at the time whether that would be a good idea. Primarily, the British had the idea that Greater Albania, just like Greater Serbia, would be the right thing to do, and so on. So they could not really find a consensus on that issue. Therefore, Kosovo has been turned into a nation state, and they immediately accepted to be Kosovars.
Mm-hmm.
They were smart enough to accept this denomination, and no problem, But Bosnians are obviously less smart, and to the present day, we have a problem to actually promote the simplest idea that we are all Bosnians and that we just have three ethno-religious groups within. And a lot of people who don't actually want to belong to any of these three groups. And at least 1/4 of the population don't care about it. But they are also streamlined into these three groups through the census, through the political parties and narratives that are being told. So if they repeat you permanently that you only have these three groups, eventually those who don't belong to that, they start questioning themselves whether they are right about it. And gradually some of them are turning towards these three identities rather than sticking to their own ones as they feel it.
It's really as banal as like a checkbox on a questionnaire. If the fourth checkbox isn't there, then the fourth identity is erased. Or the unifying one. Professor Hadžidedić, people who would like to read more from you, where should they go? Is there a place where you publish regularly your writings?
I was publishing my writings on the website nationalismstudies.org, but I would recommend them to really read the book Nations and Capital, The Missing Link in Global Expansion, published in 2022 by Routledge in London and New York.
I will put the link to that book and also to nationalismstudies.org into the description of this video here below. Everybody, please go and get yourself a copy of the book. Professor Hadžidedić, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you very much for having me.